This is a moment for the round table. And first of all, we want to thank your inspiring talks, very interesting. And I am sure that they have provoked some questions, some reflections about the topic of gender perspective in research, or feminist perspective in research, which is not exactly the same. To engage, to start this debate, I think we have heard a crossline, some key points that you share. So gender perspective share is that the focus of activism in some point, to be a feminist and to be a feminist research is in some point, or is the same that to be an academic activism in academia, and it's not easy. And the other is related with social justice, and this is important to highlight. And the third point, I think that is interesting that you share the significance of to include intersectionality in our debates, in our researches. And I think that in my impression, meanwhile I was hearing you, I remember, allow me to participate with a personal memory. I remember 19 years old, 19 years ago, I was in a conference and I was talking with a colleague. We were talking about our researches and so on. And what do you want to present, Pilar? I am presenting a research about love stereotypes in fiction. Love stereotypes in fiction in Lo Serrano, a famous series here 20 years ago, more or less. And he said to me, nonverbal communication were very expressive, say, love stereotypes in fiction. It's interesting. Non-verbal expression was very significant. Is the typical topic of a woman. Do you think that it will be useful for your academic career? Just a question, Pilar. Okay. 20 years after, I continue in love stereotypes, or not only in other type of researches, but this question is always in my head, inside, no? And sometimes, I don't know, because you are talking not only as an editor of a very important journal, you are also researchers. And I don't know, when you are working with other colleagues, if you have had the impression, in some way, to be, as Sarah Ahmed explains, perhaps to be the killjoy, la guafiestas feminista. So it's another type of pressure we have. So we have to be we have to practice feminism, academic feminism, as an activism. We have to include intersectionality, because it's social justice to include intersectionality variable. We have to admit that sometimes we are killjoy. And we have to confront that in a neoliberal space. So sometimes I'm tired. Sometimes it's hard. So thank you, and you are invited to talk about this, whatever you decide to emphasize. Perhaps Lorena has also something, and of course you are invited to participate with your comments and questions.
Oh, it's not necessary. Thank you. Well, you assume activism as reflective, and critical research on your journals, and all you speak about the influence of this social activism and this social influence and political influence in the topics on your journals. So my question is, which are the best mechanisms to return this influence from journals to this social activism or this social movement? Yeah. Which kind of compensation of responsible research we can do to improve this social movement of this neoliberal conception of these movements like feminism today.
Who wants to start?
Thank you. So I think in terms of supporting movements, there's two issues. I used to do, when I was young, I did youth research, youth culture research. And youth cultures have no memory of past youth cultures because they're too busy enjoying themselves. So there's room for feminist research to inform social movements about what's worked in the past, what's working or not working now. There's some interesting work about the Me Too movement and the slut walks. I think maybe published in your journal.
Yeah, Katie Mendes.
That have pointed out where the movement might not continue to be sustainable. So I think there's some nice dynamics between feminist research and social movements. And then you had a second question.
How to return this?
Yeah, so I think that's the returning is to do if the social movement's active and working, they haven't got that much time for the kind of reflection and thinking and trying to make those wider connections across movements and across history and think about the implications for what possibilities for action are being opened up and what are being reduced in the decisions that the social movements are making at the time, I think in an ideal world will help it move forward. And then I think in terms of neoliberalism, it's just really important to name it and to recognise what the wider systems, because the system is about individual responsibility, resilience. So it's all about loading the issues on the individual. And if you don't have a language to say, this is actually another way of oppression, then all you feel is bad about yourself. So I think being able to critique neoliberalism and to name it are really important. And to talk about the feminization of neoliberalism, those interactions for me is always interesting with post-feminism, I think are two important ways that we can contribute. Thank you, a really interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that connection between sort of feminist theorizing and activism, what I found in some of the papers that we've published in feminist media studies has been that the people who are writing the papers are often also activists in different movements. So it might be Slut Walk, or it might be, been raped but never reported, that sort of thing. So a lot of, and various hashtag campaigns. So they're writing as insider-outsiders. The Me Too material and Been Raped But Never Reported recently came out in a book by Katie Mendes, Jessica Ringrose, Jessica Ringrose, and Jessalyn Keller. And they did a lot of interviewing of women who were involved in Slut Walk and Been Raped But Never Reported. So it's sort of that dialogue in the interview process, which then they turned into a book and different journal articles. But it's that sense of, giving back into feminist activism by giving it a space and a voice, I think that is really important. But That's one of the things that we've been grappling with, and I mentioned it in my talk, is how do you keep that as an ongoing conversation, and we're exploring that at the moment with our new social media editor to try to carve out new spaces that will allow for that kind of more reactive and responsive connection. So hopefully that helps. Yeah.
I'm going to pick up where Cindy left off. So I'm going to digress for 1 minute. In my previous life, when I was a graduate student, my dissertation was actually on social movements. So I've gone completely different direction. But what that means is I've always been interested in the relationship of doing feminist research and social activism. And as a feminist sociologist, it's part of our goal to be engaged in social change and social justice. But now I'm probably going to be the killjoy on the panel because it's undervalued. And so we grapple with journal articles that need to make that theoretical and empirical contribution versus being a clear activist. So you have to figure out, there's a tension there of figuring out how to do social justice and be an activist in a very tightly constrained organizational framework that the academy is. And despite changes that have happened, it's still a really tightly constrained organizational context. And some work is valued over other work. And so because of that, it is sometimes hard to be a feminist sociologist. And I have a colleague who's actually doing research on asking academics if they're feminist sociologists or feminists and sociologists, because that's different. So if you say you're a feminist sociologist, you are often marginalized, you're pushed aside, your voice doesn't have as much meaning. And so trying to struggle with that. But then where Cindy was taking us with the social media, we at Gender and Society, we've struggled to figure out how to reach a much broader audience, because if the mission of the journal and the mission of being a feminist sociologist is to get this information out and help reinforce what great work activists are doing in the community that are often not academics at all. Most of them are not academics, because when you're an academic, you really can't be an activist in the case of the United States. So that's my second killjoy moment. But it brings brand new challenges in ways that I didn't grow up in the social media era. I'm fighting back. I have a Twitter, a Facebook, and an Instagram, but I never use them, so don't try to find me on those. I'm not sure what my passwords are to get into them. But the journal does tweet out articles, but it comes at a cost. So the example that I was talking to somebody earlier was that there was an article on fatherhood and looking at fatherhood in principally urban Black communities in the United States. And it was talking about how Black men do fatherhood differently than white middle class, middle upper class men do it. So taking this intersectionality approach, saying there are many kinds of ways you can be a father. The Twitter storm that colleague who's trying to get tenure has had to endure is daunting. Right? So the pushback is this ideological opposition of, that's not what fatherhood is, and it's from conservative right-wing groups in the United States. And it's anonymous, right? So nobody really knows who these people are. So do you engage with them? Do you not engage with them? Right? How do you keep the conversation going? But at what cost do you personally, right? And how is that going to matter for your career and for trying to do the good work that you're trying to do?
So in this case, I'm hearing that you mentioned that we are talking about mainstream and main topics. I think that sometimes, I think we can agree perhaps that mainstream is mainstream, and to be an academic, a researcher, a professor, and a mother is sometimes motherhood. For us, is also a problematic issue to solve, and how to confront that is difficult too. In this sense, I think it's the moment to open the debate to your questions and your opinions about. Who wants to start? Raise your hand. Okay. Priscilla. Priscilla is running a research about popular music and young people and sexualization in reggaeton and in other types of music, sorry. You start with reggaeton and you decide that everything is...
I did my DFM of the master with Pilar, and we had to analyze reggaeton music, but that's why I decided to open the analysis for the other genres music, as I was explaining to you during the break. But keeping in mind that you mentioned before in your presentations that the perspective of genre goes alongside a lot of different areas of knowledge, I was wondering, the question is about your own journals. How many men are publishing with you? Do you have statistics maybe? Because it's very interesting to find men that are talking about feminism and gender perspective. And also, how do you see the future of the academic journals of feminism, not just because of the role of women, but of course it is important, but also on the open science that you mentioned before?
Perhaps we can do 2-3 questions and we can answer. Vanessa is running a research about indigenous people, ecofeminism.
Yeah. That's because I have a question. Thank you for your presentations. All of you have mentioned and emphasized that we have an emergency that introduced the decolonial perspective in our researchers, and also for intersectionality, yeah? But when I see your rankings and the affiliation of your authors, I don't see any Latin American authors. And that's very paradoxically, because as you know, the colonial perspective and also intersectionality comes from Latin America or Northwestern science. So how do you explain that? Maybe what's wrong with Latin American authors, and how can we introduce the perspective of indigenous people or science that doesn't come from the Western form? Thank you.
Perhaps a third one, and we can share the answers. Mitzi, you are centered in motherhood blogs, I think.
Yes. Thank you for your presentation. And because I'm studying especially motherhood, the representation in mommy blogs, I like a lot all the presentations, but especially there was one of Krista that was focused in inequalities in private spheres. So as according to the literature I have read and even the political information and the political discourse that we have around us, this is not a topic that is very visible in general. So my question is if now this topic, the inequalities in private spheres, is being more visible or is generating any kind of interest in researches right now. And if I can, a second one is about talking about inequalities and young people and children too. If the focus of media literacy orientated to be critical about stereotypes and roles about gender is a topic that is being considered or is generating interest into in researchers. Thank you.
I will start. We should have a larger conversation before the day ends because I do research on motherhood. I have several doctoral students that are doing research on motherhood. So while I was the killjoy of how it's devalued, I would encourage you to continue doing that research. At least our journal, Gender and Society, we publish a lot on motherhood. So the trick will be for you to figure out how to, again, insert yourself into the conversation, and but it's possible, right? It's absolutely possible. I'm trying to think if we have something that has done blogs, like using blogs as the data source, and not for motherhood, but it was published within the past 2 years. She was a political scientist, and she looked at immigration sites. And so that might be a good article. One of the things I would recommend for any scholar, regardless of where they are in their trajectory, to, if you're using a method that's not as common like interviews, like many of our journals use, try to find an article too that uses that kind of data source to model your article after that. But she uses, there's online sites about immigration, and that might be a good way for you to think about trying to do that kind of work. So I would definitely encourage you to think about the journal, which then leads me to the question on Latin America. As a white woman studying Mexico, I'm really sensitive to that. It's complicated, not because there's no reason why we can't get more internationalized authorship into the journal. The trick is the same argument that I made here, is figuring out the formula. So we've had a number of manuscripts come in from Latin American scholars, so living outside the country, outside the United States, and I can tell that they haven't looked at the journal, and so the articles aren't put in this very rigid structure that we want to have it in 8,500 words. So publishing in a journal is really different than writing a book, right? Because you have different kind of space limitations, different kind of expectations. And so trying to figure out what that exact formula is really difficult. We have had a number of Latin American scholars who are at US universities, right? So when I look at the diversity of our authorship, it doesn't look like it's diverse because they all say US institutions. But I can think of several authors just in the 4 years that all they either have some, whether it's a Mexican descent, Argentinian descent, somewhere in Latin America, or they have their roots, their first generation from the Middle East or from India. And so if names aren't a great way to tell where people are from, but I'm starting to see just in the past 4, 6, 8 years that just the authorship is really quite diverse, but the institutions are not diverse. And that's a problem. And that's absolutely a problem. There was something else you asked, I think.
Male authors.
Oh, the male authors. Oh, this is a great question. I don't know the answer to this, but if I could get Wi-Fi, I will use WhatsApp and get to Joe and say, do we have stats on, and we should have stats on gender. Maybe we do have the stats, but she didn't give me those stats before I left. So my impression is only anecdotal. It's way more women publishing than men. But it's improving. It definitely is improving, but often men are studying it's masculinities. They're not studying a broader range of topics. But I will see if I can find out the answer to that and somehow get that to you. There was something else. Oh, open science. Oh, so sociologists don't like open science. There's been a real pushback on it, for better or worse, because your goal is to get your research out as quickly as possible and to as broad of an audience as you can, right? Because we make ourselves irrelevant when we don't get that information out quickly and we don't get it out to a broader audience. But at least within sociology, there's been a real reservation to dealing with open science because it's somehow not seen as valued and less legitimate outlets. But the other problem is we don't have any money, right? We don't get big funding like STEM grants do. I mean, if I got a grant for $10,000 and over in engineering, they'd be like, wow, really? $10,000, right? They're getting multi-million-dollar grants, and written into the grant is an expectation. So there's money in those grants to be able to pay for the open access. So we're not there yet in terms of where we're going. It'll be interesting to see where we are in another decade, because I think that is the wave of the future. But there's got to be a better way than having to pay $3,000 US for open access, which is a typical rate. I think I answered all the questions.
I'll just do these in the order that actually they were asked because I jotted them down. We, male authors, we actually have quite a lot, and it has been increasing, and I would say especially with younger scholars who don't necessarily feel that it's an awkward place to be. And a lot of the research, that's feeding back, isn't it?
Feeding back on me.
A lot of the research is around masculinities, but not exclusively. There's a lot that's just much more general, talking about different media, different identities in media, sexualities. Very broad range. So, but I've not crunched the stats, and I don't know if the journal actually keeps that data. I don't think they ask for your gender when you submit a paper. So it would just have to be done on trying to recognize certain names as masculine or feminine. So I'm not quite sure, but you know, sometimes I have to deal with authors quite directly, and so that helps as well in terms of getting a sense. But I think it has definitely grown a lot. In the early days, there was nothing, no men published in feminist media studies. And I would say in the last decade, it's just gone up and up and up, which is great to see. I'm not going to answer anything on open science because I'm not sure what I have to add to that anyway. So I'll just skip on to Latin American authors. Where are they? Non-Western perspectives, yes, we do get papers from Latin American scholars, particularly those who have ended up at US universities. We get a lot of that. But, you know, we haven't had a lot of papers from scholars who are from, say, South American universities. I think I mentioned this in my presentation, and also African countries, with the exclusion of South Africa. We get a lot of papers from South Africa. How to encourage that? I'm not quite sure. I think we actually will take papers that aren't written in English. Not a lot of people know that, but we will find reviewers who speak that language and have research interests that are as similar as possible. If we think that it's something we'd like to publish. So anybody who's thinking of submitting to the journal, if you feel uncomfortable with writing in English, then, you know, probably as a first port of call, it's just send me an email and explore the possibilities, but it should be doable. I've actually got a paper written in Spanish from somewhere in Spain, I can't remember, that is out for review at the moment. So it's, you know, we do that. But it is, you know, it also has to do something, it has something to do with what Krista pointed out in terms of, you know, the structures of writing those kinds of articles, and what the expectations of the journal are. So that those are things that we continuously have conversations about, is how do we make this easier or more welcoming to people who aren't coming from that kind of Anglo-American background. Mummy blogs. We have published quite a few papers on mummy blogs in the last 10 years. We get a lot, actually. And there's a couple of women who've written the very first papers in the journal on mummy blogs who get inundated with requests to review these new papers on mummy blogs. So it is a really popular topic at the moment. So I don't see that abating. So if you are interested, you know, go to the journal. They're there. And you know, again, if you want to have a conversation with me about what you're doing and any bits of advice you'd like, I'm happy to talk to you as well. And on inequalities in young people and media literacy, this is actually a topic that is very close to my heart, because I do research on children in news and citizenship, and a big aspect of that is centers on their engagement with the news, their news literacy, and the need to bring them into and have them participate in news culture, either as just engaging with the news or creating their own news, these sorts of issues. It doesn't really get an outlet in feminist media studies so much, although I just wrote something on girls who do journalism or have political blogs that, here's a plug for my, I think Frederick mentioned it, Journalism, Gender and Power book that just came out a few weeks ago, where I write about girls who do political blogs and community journalism. But a great journal for that is obviously the Journal of Children in Media, where over the years there have been a number of really good papers on children's media literacy. I think that's it.
What interesting, isn't it? So, men and feminism, yes, definitely. I think there's that balance between creating a space for women to have access to the public sphere, and feminist spaces sometimes are women only or women dominant for that reason, and I think that's good. There was a while where some men were calling themselves pro-feminist to kind of respect the fact they couldn't call themselves feminist, but I liked it, which was nice to be sensitive. But I like us all to be feminists, I think, now, and I think what's also being talked about is the younger generation feel like that. So I have a PhD student who's an Indian man who identifies as a feminist, and I find it really cute when I hear him say it, because it's so natural and normal for him. He doesn't, it's not a problematic term at all. I think that's what we should be aiming for, really, so it's great. We haven't got, I mean, we would publish, we wouldn't choose whether to publish or not because of someone's, gendered identification. But feminism is not as high status as, I don't know, whatever the other non-feminist stuff is, so we don't have to worry about that too soon. When we become really high status and men want to publish excessively in our journals, then have to think about it. Have to quote to them. That's a joke. Okay, so yeah, it's good to have men in feminist journals, obviously. Feminism and open science. So I do try and read this stuff, but I find it really tedious. So and my brain doesn't really hold those terribly important facts together. No, there's so many arguments going on, and so the things that I pay attention to are, the thing that worries me most is what I was alluding to. If you're doing really sensitive qualitative research, you're doing stuff that's building a relationship, and that relationship is ignored by open science talk that's about sort of STEM subjects. And so we've got a real problem that's not really recognised across all research, that the people who participate, well, it is recognised but not engaged with, are people who, I think they call them the wealthy and the better, or the best and better. They're people that are healthy, they're people that are wealthy, they're people with reading age that's really quite high. For a standard psychology questionnaire, you've wiped out 25% of the population already. So we already exclude lots of people in our research. And I think open science really threatens to exclude even more. I mean, I've done research with drug users. They would never share that info. You know, it took a lot of time to have them speak to me. To think that that's just going to be out there for anyone to use. Then there's concerns around, well, who would use it? You know, you can imagine, I did a kind of sympathetic piece on trying to understand the nature of their experiences. We could imagine, their words being totally thrown against them by a researcher with a different agenda. There's concerns about kind of vampire researchers. If you've done all this work collecting data and then it goes out there and someone else just waits for it to arrive, which will happen because we're in this massively competitive market with each other. So on the one hand, it feels, this is a sort of feminist killjoy moment. Open science should be really exciting, right? And just we're talking about people in South America, part of the issue is resources, right? Those resources are going to be opened up to the world. It should be really exciting, and instead of which we're all a bit like, oh, and I don't want to be someone that's not seeing the possibilities, but I think the language of possibility is hiding some of the risks that we have, and kind of absenting or ignoring our own practices and needs as researchers, as feminist researchers. The Latin American question, I think a lot of it's been answered. I think it's resources, I think it's language. We had a really interesting experience at a conference colleague of mine organised in South America, and he basically said, if you're in a South American country, if you can get here, everything else will be free. And nobody came. They just couldn't manage the resources for their flights. So, we kind of feel like we're scrabbling around for resources in our own institutions, and there's been a sort of austerity drives. But really that was a huge sort of demonstration of even when you try and create a more level playing field, that you're not in any way being able to do that. So I think that's a big issue. But I also think the writing style is a big issue. It's a very different style. And maybe we could think about developing our different kinds of commentary sections to have, the South American contribution section, and then allow people to write in the way that they want to write, and then we can learn from them. That might be a way of kind of doing that. I think there's some really interesting research in Indigenous knowledges in Canada and to some extent New Zealand, and perhaps there can be some liaisons with people in South America. Obviously there probably are as well, but to kind of tap into funding. So the great secret is to find out who's got the money and then tap into their funding. So if the Canadians are funding it, find a Canadian you can work with, make some kind of justification for why you need some intercultural comparison, and then, get their taxpayers' money. That's the plan, guys. I have practiced that plan, should we say. So where are we now? Motherhood's a central feature of feminist research. So, it's one of the topics that is regularly in feminism and psychology. Women's domestic work, women's participation in private sphere. The personal is political, obviously, is a feminist mantra, and so we will see that as a central concern and of interest to the journal. And equally, I think research looking at how gender is negotiated in media literacy debates is really important. So I'm thinking about, again, Jessica Ringrose's work looking at schools' work on sexting and how it blames, the women are then the young girls and women are held responsible for managing their sexuality so that boys don't have access to it and then kind of share it around. So those kind of critical feminist engagements with what we're teaching young women and young men and boys in schools is like an essential part of I think what we would consider as the remit of feminism and psychology, definitely. So thank you.
You want to highlight?
Yeah, I wanted to build on something that Sarah was just saying. So it's not only the journal's responsibility to try to figure out how to tap into a broader audience. I also see it very much as the publisher's responsibility. So journals are owned by big publishers. So we're both in Sarah's journal and Gender and Society. It's Sage. It's a Sage journal. And what we have noticed is when Sage makes an inroad into a new country for the first time, our manuscripts from those scholars from that country skyrocket. So last year, Sage went into Israel. And all of a sudden, we got all these manuscripts from Israeli scholars. The year before, I think it was a couple of years prior to that, went into Australia, which also then we saw a real increase in Australian scholarship as well. And so if we can figure out how to engage publishing companies like Sage to get into these other countries, then that means you have greater access to being able to actually read the journal. Because how can you figure out where you're going to talk, your entry point is into the conversation if you can't read the journal, right? And that's a problem. And so how to get these publishers to expand out, I'm not sure the way to go about doing that. Maybe they have a comment page on their website and say, can you please get into Latin America more? Because it is really difficult. So it's not just the journals, it's at higher level as well. And then the other thing I started thinking about with the open science is, so US funding agencies, and I'm not sure how I feel about this yet for the very reasons that Sarah talked about. When you're a qualitative researcher, you feel it's your data. It's very personal. You collected that data. You potentially spent years living somewhere else to collect that data, to then all of a sudden be forced to have to make that available, even if it's de-identified data. But the National Science Foundation, I had no idea until a couple months ago, requires that any funding from the organization has to be deposited when the study is done. And I found this out because one of my doctoral students was one of 15 scholars in the US to get a doctoral dissertation research improvement grant from the National Science Foundation. It's a big thing to get as a PhD student. And we had to write in our data management plan, because they kicked it back to us to expand on this, how we were going to share the data. And I was like, whoa, we're not sharing that data with anybody. And so then I started to look. University of Michigan is a holder of quantitative databases, so you can tap into those to use secondary data. But all that's been collected by somebody else, these large organizations that collect this data. It's all been de-identified. There's not this personal connection with the data. But I'm not sure where it's going. But my student, who's going to be looking at Arab Muslim men and women in the workplace, we're going to have to put her some of the information on the website, and we're working with NSF to figure out what we can do, like what's the bare minimum we can put up there for very real reasons. She's looking at women who wear the hijab and women who don't, et cetera, in the workplace. This is a very vulnerable population. But I think there is a trend with trying to put qualitative research out there, and I'm uncomfortable with it. I'm just not sure what to do.
If I can add to that, so I had a Research Council funded project, so UK funded project, and there again the expectation is to upload the data. It was quite an interesting experience though, because obviously it's anonymized first, and then you can deduct anything, you can make a statement about why. So I removed, so the project had been about identity, and I removed all the discussion about them selling drugs because it wasn't part of the research question, and it made them vulnerable, I thought, to all sorts of things like journalists, for example, to the police, because there were particular youth cultures that couldn't be identified but would be flagged up then as a focus. So we were able, we had kind of full responsibility. They never saw the data, the raw data, so I was the arbitrator of what got shown. And similarly, I've had colleagues who've done alcohol research, and they've just said no because the marketing companies will come in. And then there's a sort of a wall, so it's held by the funding council, and if you want to see it, you can write to them, and then they'll release it. So there is a little bit of there's a little bit of control, and in a way, I found it really useful because I think, well, at least other people might get to see this data because I never finish off the project as much as I want. So in that way, I found it quite liberating that it was out there. And and there's a big argument in the UK about doing secondary data analysis because you're wasting people's time and your own time with all these interviews and, very labor-intensive process, and people have given you their kind of personal stories and then you use them for one article or one book or something. So, so there's an argument for you, and also it's public funded money to do this research, so there's a justification economically to use the data more often. So I found those things quite good, but I think I uploaded it at a time when ideologically the UK is still quite different from the US, so all we need is someone to really target, like a researcher, once they know that your student does this particular work, it might be quite easy then to really suddenly become quite vulnerable to this process. And then I think it's really about the institutions knowing that their job is to protect us. And I don't think that's the case in the UK at all, not at university level. It isn't.
More questions, please.
We don't have time, so please, one question or two. One.
Well, it's a question and it's a comment about open science, because my presentation this afternoon, I'm sorry, because it will be in Spanish, I think. and it's about open science and data. So in Europe, at least, so the European Commission has a motto, open your data as open as possible and as close as necessary. So when you submit when you get funds from the Commission, so it's one of the things you have to do is research data management. And if you cannot open the data, so you have to contact your officer and say, no, because my data are sensitive or are kind of ethical behavior that I cannot share with the community. And so, it's not you don't have to with, they are not behind you with a stick, but also with a carrot. So I wanted to make this clear because it's not a question of this is my treasure, in terms of sharing. I think science is open. Science should be collaborative, and part of this collaboration could be sharing your data because they are secondary analysis, they are also complementary analysis. You can work in the United States, I can work here, we can share our data and compare even behaviors between different cultures and citizens or people. So I don't think data is, in principle, not to be, they are allowed to be shared and, of course, under ethical behaviors. And so following these kind of rules that if they are not, they are not able to be shared, so close them. But in principle, most of the data can be open without being afraid of being scooped or anything. So that's. Well, it was a comment. I don't know if you want to add anything.
I'll just add one thing real quickly because I know we're running out of time. I think some of the pushback on, so thank you very much for that, and for both of you, because this was a whole new realm that I hadn't really realized we were going to have to share the data. But I think part of the pushback is qualitative data, when you're sharing it, even if some of it's in a redacted form, is completely devoid of context, right? And qualitative data is all about the context. And so if you don't understand the context within which the scholar, whoever that scholar is, and whatever location they were, then you're missing a nuance to be able to really understand what that interview data or those participant observation data means. And so my concern is when it's devoid of context in that larger understanding, what does that mean for the rigorousness of the research, right? And how can that data and information be twisted in such a way that it ends up being more harmful than trying to make social change?
Sorry, I think we have to close the moment, very unfortunately. Thank you so much for your talks, and thank you so much for your participation. Perhaps you want to.
I only will to say that I really love the sentence that I think that resume or brief the aims of the 3 journals: theoretical contributions beyond empirical contributions. And I think that this is just the characteristic of these journals that make the difference in terms of quality. And I will be, I'm sorry, I am grateful, I am glad sorry, I'm nervous. I'm glad to share with us this session and your lectures, and also this gentle attention for our questions on gender and communication on journal in our academy. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I want to put in one more plug. I completely forgot. So Gender and Society, and Frederick, I can send it to you. It has a PDF for international scholars, and it's 2 or 3 pages, and it's tips for international scholars that talks about getting into the journal. I brought a hard copy with me that I could give you, but since we're in a paperless society, I will get it to you so that maybe you can send it out on your listservs or what have you. Thank you. Thank you.
Posa la teva presentació. Well, I'm really sorry because the roundtable was really interesting, but we are running out of time. So we have, I think that it's 40 minutes, 35, but let's say 50 minutes. So probably you'll have 25 minutes both. And let's start now. We have finished the first section of the conference on gender studies, feminist gender studies and communication. And now we will move to more, let's say, broad aspects of the process of researching and publishing in academic communication journals. For this short section, we have with us Celia Willem, the editor of the Catalan Journal of Communication and Cultural Studies. Welcome, and Stuart Allen, the editor of Journalism Education. We'll start with Celia Willem's presentation, some editorial experiences at the Catalan Journal of Communication and Cultural Studies. And, well, Celia Willem is an associate professor at the Universitat Rovira i Virgili in Tarragona, and she's the main editor of the Catalan Journal of Communication and Cultural Studies since 2014. The journal is interested in original research from communication and cultural studies. Probably Celia will tell you more about that. She holds a PhD in communication from the Universitat de Barcelona, and her current research interest lies in the intersection of gender, class, and race as markers of identity, and in technology as a driving force of both perpetuation of and resistance to oppression, violence, and inequalities. So it's quite related to what we've been listening before her. Celia, your turn. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frederick. Well, in the first place, thank you for having me again. This is my third time at the International Conference of Academic Communication Journals, so I'm very proud of that. And this year, it is a bit special because as a feminist scholar, I was specifically interested in this session. So, but I'm actually the editor of a generic communication journal, so that's interesting. What happens when a feminist scholar is the editor of a generic journal? So our first issue came out in 2009. We have 2 issues per year, one miscellaneous and one special issue. With a lot of different topics, different methodologies. We accept both, you know, the classical, let's say, content analysis in media, quantitative studies, qualitative studies, close readings of cultural products. We're a cultural studies journal as well, television series, ethnographic studies, journalistic practices, etc. So we have a lot of different, let's say, topics. Thank you. Well, this is a little bit the the usual thing about abstracting and indexing, and there's a lot has been said about that already today. I was going to go into that a little bit, but I think it's clear that this is a major issue for most of the journals in our field to get the highest impact factor possible, etc. It's a lot of pressure. So that's a lot has been said about that already today. So as a cultural studies journal, so it's not only about communication, it's also cultural studies. The gender perspective is always present in our editorial line. Why? Because what cultural studies does is unpack power relationships, right? So in the media, this is very, and in communication processes, this is very clear. It's essential to unpack these power relationships in terms of gender in all kinds of cultural products, understood as in a very broad sense. So the cultural studies perspective actually understands communication as a social construct. And so the gender perspective is not only inevitable for me, it's imperative. So that's what we've been doing for the last 5 years. So we try to, we really get a lot of manuscripts that touch on gender as a cross-cutting issue in our journal. And I made a little bit of statistics. So in the last 5 years, we've had 31% of articles with a gender perspective. This also includes, so not only feminist perspective, but also LGBTQ plus A plus whatever it is nowadays. So we actually have a lot of, in each issue, there's at least one article that is that works with this gender perspective or a gender approach. We had, 2 years ago, we had a special issue guest edited by Nuria Rauna, Sophie van Baal, and Frederick Danens from the University of Ghent. This was an issue that came out of a conference 2 years earlier, of course, yeah, it's a 2 years process at least. A conference that we held at the University of Rovira Virgili, organized by the Gender and Communication section of the ICRIA major congress. So, you know that ICRIA has several sections. Every 2 years, there's the main conference, and then we have the off events every other year. So one of these off events was organized by the gender section, and this is where the special issue came from. So from the point of view of an editor, this is always very interesting to get special issues that come out of conferences. Actually, I brought a hard copy, even in a paperless society. This is our issue on gender studies. And last year we had one on game studies. And even here, like 3 of the 10 articles are with a gender perspective. So looking at women gamers, but also looking at the gender perspective in characters in games, etc. So we do have that kind of contributions from authors as well. This is our editorial team. We have Yolanda Tortajada, who is also here, the associate editor. She always helps me with good advice and criteria. She's also our book review editor. Book reviews is a section we have in the journal, which is, but it's really, for me, it's kind of a little let's say, jewel at the end of each miscellaneous issue, because we really select the most important books of the previous year. Now, this is already, Frederick asked me to give some tips for people. If you look at the book review section of a journal, you can pretty much know what the editorial line is of the journal, because these book reviews are selected by us. So we actually select the books that need to be reviewed, which says something about, you know, the editorial line of the journal. We have an international advisory board, and our publisher is it's a British journal. The publisher is Intellect. It's a very small publisher. It's not Sage. It's not Elsevier, but they have like a niche market of cultural studies and film studies. They have a journal called Heavy Metal. It's kind of things they publish. So the particularity of the Catalan Journal of Communication and Cultural Studies is that it's actually both a local and an international journal. So what is the incentive for authors then to publish in the Catalan Journal? Because they can actually get published their research on Catalan, Spanish, and Latin American issues in an English-speaking journal, which is it's an incentive for authors. It's also an alternative to the other major Spanish communication journals. few of which have an impact factor actually. So it's a good alternative, and they get a more international readership. And then for foreign authors, it's a little bit the same, but the other way around. They can publish on topics of their own countries that will be read by a more local readership here in Catalonia and Spain. And we, of course, always welcome comparisons between realities of other countries and Spain or Catalonia. So all our articles are published in English. We do have a section called Gateway, which is a section in the journal where we publish, where we translate articles that have been published elsewhere, and always if the author gets the permission to translate their article. So, but we don't have gateways in every issue. So it's a little bit a section that is a little bit underrepresented at the moment. But in general, all the manuscripts are in English. So our incentive for this, for this journal to keep on going is actually this: we can bring local topics into the international arena and the other way around. So Frederick asked me to introduce a little bit good practices or tips for young scholars or for beginning scholars to publish. I'm going to talk a little bit about the reviewing process in general, but a lot has been said already. I mean, I think we all have the same kind of reviewing process. So we get the manuscripts, and in the first stage, we will let's say do a first kind of filter where manuscripts are accepted for review or rejected on the basis of not being in scope or not attaining to the minimum quality, academic quality that the journal requires. And then the reviewing process starts with a double-blind reviewing process. So as everybody else, we have a lot of problems looking for reviewers as well. In my experience, in my first years, it was easier to pass on so a manuscript on a certain topic within the field of communication. You could pass on to someone who was just a communication scholar, and the last years they start to say, "But that's not my field." It's getting very much specialized now. So you have to look for reviewers that are exactly of that field or that topic, and you get a lot of rejections of reviewers as well, which is logical as they don't have. Yeah, it's voluntary, So that's one of the problems. So sometimes the reviewing process, if it takes long, I can assure you it's not because we want it to take long. It's a very long process. Reviewers do not always hand their reports in on time, or we ask for some additional information, etc. So it's a long process. What we see is some new tendencies in reviewing. I don't know if you've had any experience with that. There's starting to emerge like this tendency of open reviewing, where you put your paper online and get people to comment on your paper, so that the reviewing process becomes more transparent and also a collective process of learning, which is interesting in my view. We don't have, so Intellect doesn't have that policy yet, but I think that's one of the things that is going to happen in the future more. The same for preprints. Preprints are papers that are published in a repository or on a preprint public server, where the paper is published before peer reviewing. This also has advantages because you can already have your paper out there before it gets accepted. Some journals don't accept preprints yet, Some do, so that's kind of a tendency that's going to happen. And then, of course, what... sorry, forgot your name. No, Krista. What Krista said about the online first policy, where where you have a lot of a big volume of manuscripts that have to be processed, but you don't have an issue yet where you can assign them. So you put them already online first in a fast track, and then usually the article will take 1 or 2 years, up to 2 years, to get assigned to an actual issue. So that's I can see that happening. I'm talking more as an author because the Catalan journal doesn't have that option yet. But that's where I think where it's gonna go. So, Freddie, you said 10 minutes, so I'm going to finish almost. Some tips, like practical tips, in line of what Krista said again, but she explained it really well. Read about the conversation that's going on within the journal. So you should read several articles first, because before sending your manuscript to a journal, first look at the other articles that have been accepted. Not only because of the topics, but also because of the theoretical body of research, because of the style, the kind of approach. So that's interesting. Sometimes we just send our manuscripts to random journals, thinking that my article is so good that we'll accept it, but then without looking at other articles that have been published before. Always respect deadlines. It's very difficult for us to make exceptions when people say, okay, I see that the deadline was last week, but could you accept this? It's a difficult issue because no, we can't, but sometimes it's so interesting that you can't say no, or you won't want to say no, or whatever, but so it's a bad start if you ask for exceptions. So always respect deadlines. Also read formal requirements before submitting, in the sense that you need to know what the extension is, maximum extension, the referencing style. Usually journals have a referencing style guides that you can download, note for contributors, look at all the details, look at what you need to submit, if you need to submit a separate metadata document or whatever. Now this is getting a lot more automated now with the platforms. Since last year, since 2018, Intellect has also switched to an online platform. So this makes it a little bit easier, because you get to check off the things that you need to hand in. So that's getting better in that sense. But still, there are many people who miss details. And of course, the importance of the abstract. Your abstract should reflect your article, because in my case, I still have time to read articles by it. But if you get 500 a year, you cannot read every article until the end. So you very much rely on the abstract and diagonal reading. So the abstract should reflect your article. That makes our job a lot easier. Yeah, and make sure your manuscript is in line with the journal's scope and editorial policy. We sometimes get abstracts from people. Do you think this would fit in your journal? Like the scope and the aims of the journal are published. Yeah, as Krista said, you should know if it's appropriate or not. So. Yeah, it doesn't look very professional to send an email to an editor and say, would this fit into your journal? So you submit your manuscript, and then we will tell you. So yeah, and it's not on the screen. But my major tip would be, or advice would be, keep on submitting your stuff. It will get published, and you cannot at some point, and you will not publish if you don't submit. So please feel encouraged to send your work to whatever it is. Choose carefully and do the effort, because you will get published at some point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Celia. We are not running out of time anymore, so thank you for these 15 minutes. And now the last presentation comes from Cardiff again. It's a presentation by Professor Stuart Allen. He's the editor of Journalism Education, and he will present new strategies for academic publishing. Stuart Allen, as I said, is professor and head of the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University. He has published widely in journalism, media and cultural studies. He's a founding co-editor of the online journal Journalism Education that is published by the Association for Journalism Education and serves on the editorial boards of 15 international journals. Stuart, your turn. Excuse me.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
May I begin by expressing my sincere thanks to Frederick and for the very kind invitation to participate in today's discussion, and to his colleagues for organizing this really impressive event. I'm honored to have this opportunity to speak with you and to share this platform with Celia and the other editors and academics, all of whom are doing such interesting and important work. My presentation is going to revolve primarily around the interests, I hope, of PhD students, early career researchers, but also anyone who happens to be a supervisor in the room as well. And I'd like to begin by posing a question of sorts, and that is the traditional old saying, publish or perish. I don't actually have a question mark there, but that's my very first point. And I thought we might as well answer that one right from the outset. Allow me to recommend to you that you publish rather than perish. So, right then, now what? Well, let's also point out that far too many postgraduate theses, MA and PhD theses, end up languishing on a library shelf, collecting dust, with all of that extraordinarily hard work the student has done being left behind without any sort of acknowledgement by the academic community, beyond the examiners and supervisors and so forth. So in my 20 minutes today, I want to grapple with some of the thorny issues involved in research and publication in that regard. And here I need to concede at the outset that when the conference organizers invited me to offer a paper along these lines, I considered the prospect to be a rather daunting one. There is a real risk in listening to me blather on that I end up sounding like an egomaniac, or that I sound patronizing, holding myself up as an exemplar of sorts. And I admire our previous speakers who've done and handled these issues so eloquently. But I would like to be very clear in my case, and that is to the extent to which I've learned anything about the rules to the whole career thing, it has been by breaking them. No doubt you are getting used to conflicting advice from gray-haired academics, so I have every confidence that you will happily decide to ignore much of what I am about to say. I know I would have done precisely that when I was an early career researcher or PhD student. So my credentials, such as they are, to date, as Frederick pointed out, I've authored 7 books, edited or co-edited 13 others, written well over 100 journal articles, chapters and edited collections and the like. I'm a former book series editor with Open University Press in the UK, where I published 42 books in my series. I've helped to edit an encyclopedia, a wide range of other kinds of things. Founding co-editor of, as Frederick mentioned, the Open Access Journal, which just means that it's free to anyone who wants to read it or contribute to it. Journalism Education, which was launched by the Association for Journalism Education a few years ago. And I serve on the editorial boards of 15 international journals, and there's a quick list of some of them, which I've just pinched from my blog. I'm currently co-writing a new book for Routledge on the history of war photography. I'm co-writing another one for Oxford University Press on visual citizenship, and I have the next one already contracted with Polity Press in Cambridge. I'm constantly refereeing other people's work, funding applications for all of the major research councils, book proposals for a wide range of publishers and journal articles and so forth. Indeed, I reckon I referee on average 2 or 3 journal articles a month, and sometimes a lot more all year round. So, all of that, and I'm willing to bet that almost none of you have ever heard of me before. Which goes to show that if you want to be famous, you best go into a different line of work. In thinking about fame, putting this presentation together, it occurred to me that I should mention that I went to secondary school in Canada, growing up with Jim Carrey. And he went on to find a certain fame and fortune in Hollywood. Jim and I were good friends, we were science partners, we played a lot of sport together and so forth. He makes about 20 million for a film, and I make zilch, 0, for a journal article. But I digress, I'm not bitter. I should say I had a lot of fun putting that slide together, and it definitely slowed down the preparation of this talk, I can tell you. Funny thing is, I look at Jim's pictures today, and I think he's starting to age a little bit, that fellow. Strange. My first journal article appeared in the Journal of Communication Inquiry in the US in 1987. I'm now in my mid-50s, so you can do the maths. But you can tell I was pretty young and would have appreciated a few words of advice at that time, if only to ignore them. So let's ask the awkward question: why publish in the first place? We have established that you don't want to perish and that you want to make the most of your thesis, to share it with others. In other words, you wish to contribute to the scholarly community, to help advance knowledge in your field, or as Krista Bromley said, to insert yourself in the conversation. And you should do so. You also want a job and a publication or two to help establish your credentials as a fast-rising, respected authority in the area is a good idea. To be famous, see your names up in lights, well, we probably ruled that one out, but certainly a little name recognition opens up doors. Certain opportunities present themselves, such as being asked to contribute a chapter to an edited collection or an article to a journal, or to speak at a conference. Publishing gets your name around, including with publishers, not surprisingly. So you may be asked by one of them to be a reviewer for a book proposal or to referee a journal article. And you will probably have an easier time persuading a publisher to publish your work. And that's the usual catch-22 here, in that it's much easier to get published once you have been published. So, fair enough. What's the downside of trying to get published in this early point in your career? What are the pitfalls? Well, time spent preparing a publication is usually time not spent on writing the thesis. This when your department is probably under pressure to ensure you complete on time so as to maintain their success rate. An emphasis on publication may mean that you forgo other aspects of your professional development, such as teaching experience. There is also the issue of your own personal subjectivity. Having an article accepted for publication is a wonderful boost to the ego, but what happens if that article you agonized over forever is rejected? Suffice it to say, and I think this has been pointed out this morning already, you need a hide as thick as a rhinoceros skin for the insulting comments that will be fired in your direction in the academic jungle. One problem with the anonymous refereeing system is that sometimes reviewers can be insensitive to those still learning the craft of article writing, and postgrads can be especially vulnerable to criticism. Even within departments, things can go wrong. Students can find their work plagiarized by unscrupulous supervisors. Students contributing to team research projects can see their names accidentally left off the ensuing publication or relegated to a little thank you footnote, even when they may have done a large share of the research and writing. The denial of proper acknowledgement can be really difficult to endure, and I speak from experience as a survivor of it, not as the perpetrator, I hasten to add. Some department managers are supportive, but others can place unreasonable pressure on students to push ahead with publications prematurely. Some managers can be suspicious of students who want to publish, perhaps even feeling a sense of rivalry. In any case, though, even when you reach the point when you send off an article for publication, with a journal, let's say, you soon discover that the wheels of academic publication grind very slowly indeed. And we've heard various examples of that this morning. It can take, as has been pointed out, it can take weeks before your article is even acknowledged, and a few months more before the referee's comments are gathered and sent to you with some sort of editorial decision attached. It's quite possible that major revisions will be requested, which can set you back a few more months. And even then, there's no guarantee that your article will be accepted. When it is accepted, let's be upbeat here, it may take, depending on the journal, a year or two before, presto, your article sees the light of day, by which time, needless to say, you are thoroughly embarrassed by every hopelessly naive thing you said in it, and wish that you had never been so foolish to write it in the first place. Well, we can relax, because various studies claim to show that the average journal article is read by about 16 people on planet Earth, and most of them are just checking to see whether or not their journal article is in the reference list. It's truly bizarre when you think about it. Only pinheads with PhDs could dream up a system whereby they provide the content free of charge to a commercial journal publisher, and then, wait for it, feel eternally grateful when their research is accepted for publication so that the publisher can turn around and get rich with the profits. How much money do you make for a journal article? In most countries, nothing. For a contribution to an edited collection? Well, if you're lucky, really lucky, you may get a copy of the edited collection when it is published. For writing a book, well, it depends on the book, but it will have to sell very well indeed just to cover the cost of writing it. Once you add in the books you had to buy in order to write it, the new computer, the bottles of wine, and so forth, it's an expensive proposition. Speaking of writing books, in most countries, very few publishers are interested in book proposals based on PhD theses, unfortunately. Publishers are increasingly student-led in their editorial decisions, so unless your research topic connects with undergraduate teaching modules, it's unlikely to register with capitalist publishers with a big ka-ching. Your work, once it is in their hands, is considered to be a commodity. If in their judgment it is unlikely to sell, or sell in sufficient numbers to justify the cost of knocking down trees to make it, then that's probably the end of the story. Or in some cases, there might be a further option, and that is to publish it as a hardback-only edition, which is usually very expensive. There is a business model there which relies on libraries buying such texts, but even many of them are balking now just because of the cutbacks to library budgets. Now, this doesn't mean that publishers are failing to recognize the academic merits of your work. They probably do recognize them. It's just that they can't afford to publish books that won't sell. Not if they want to stay in business. That's the bad news. The good news is that there's never been so many journals in circulation, a surprisingly high number of which are desperate for good articles. And articles derived from PhD theses are often very good indeed. And why is that? Mainly because in contrast with full-time academics, doctoral students have time to read extensively, and crucially, have time to think. And well, you laugh, but it gets increasingly difficult to think as you progress along, at least certainly in my experience. Now, lurking in the shadows of this list of pitfalls, at least in the UK, is what has already been mentioned by Sarah Riley, and that is our Research Excellence Framework, which is an audit of research conducted at UK universities. And I understand there's a version of that in Spain, and I know that many other countries around the world have a version of it too. In the UK, the REF has a record that is at best mixed. There have been some positive benefits of it, but also a lot of negatives. Dwelling on the negatives, there's a certain pressure to play safe, to be mainstream. to improve the odds that your work will be accepted by major publishers and journals. There's also a marked tendency to work to ref deadlines and timetables, rather than the sort of timeframes that might make more sense for the actual research project underway. There's a danger that the ref in our field will start to emulate the quantitative measures of the hard or natural sciences, which I think would be seriously problematic. For the time being, though, we expect a more qualitative approach, which isn't perfect, but much better, relatively speaking. And the last pitfall, in a nutshell, time spent trying to get published is time away from the thesis, as we have said, but it is also time away from other important things. So things like having fun that otherwise keep you sane, enjoying the company of other people, and feeling upbeat about life and your work in general. Because let's be honest, the party is over. We really missed the golden days of academia, when there was little, if ever, any pressure to publish. Back then, one could be vulgar enough to feel compelled to publish something if it was really necessary, but it wasn't the sort of thing to be encouraged. The compulsion to publish was unseemly. Certainly the quality of the scholarship was likely to be suspect. Ideas needed time to germinate, sometimes over decades. So in the meantime, you could sit in your book-lined office, sipping sherry, looking out the window for hours on end. Whereas today, the hyper 24/7 culture of academia means that the conveyor belts and the scholarly sausage factory run ever faster. Bangers and mashing out bangers, to use a sort of a British phrase. Distinctions between work time and leisure time have become hopelessly blurred. So, in the interest of quality of life considerations, what kind of supports do you need? Well, research training certainly helps. Short courses can offer help with research methods or with gathering data or maybe with accessing information and resources. Conference funds are extraordinarily beneficial, providing you with a wonderful opportunity to test out ideas. Mentoring is invaluable, not just your supervisor, to help with the research and writing and publication process. Gaining advice about how best to go about developing a publishing strategy. Find out where does it make sense to try to publish. Do you start with a book review or a conference review, perhaps, in the first instance? Would the literature review chapter of your thesis make a nice, tidy journal article? How about that methodology chapter? Perhaps it is innovative enough to warrant publication as an article. And what other related sorts of things that are a little harder to distinguish, like help with networking. A conference like this one is a good place to be because it might help you tap into other academic networks. A lot of students need help just tapping into the research cultures within their own department. Now, you may say you need help to make the most of these sorts of opportunities that may be available, such as department research groups, research seminars, conference organization, teacher training, and advice on the whole career thing. So to begin wrapping up, what can I say by way of humble advice in this regard? There are no rules. Life happens. Enjoy yourself. Research and writing get slightly easier as you go along, but are still impossibly hard. No matter what, the white screen is frustratingly blank. The cursor blinks. The blinker curses. After all, you've been sitting there since first thing in the morning, staring at that blank screen, when you suddenly realize, okay, admittedly after playing several levels of your favorite game, updating your Facebook, monitoring Twitter, Googling your own name, and checking your email at least 1,000 times, but enough about me, you suddenly realize it's time for lunch or dinner, and you have not written a word. This is probably the most important thing I'm about to say here. Self-loathing is a powerful motivator to finally start writing something. And so you do, and it's awful. So you bang your head on your keyboard and you start over again, after one more computer game, of course. But seriously, when it's all said and done, academic life is a privileged life. And if you're stuck for something to say when writing, you can do worse than take a fresh look at your topic from an alternative counterposition. That is, ask yourself, if you haven't done so already, Wherein lie the relations of power shaping your research questions? What does your thesis topic look like from the vantage point of the poor, the disadvantaged, or the vulnerable? How can you make your work more relevant to those shut out of academic experience, who didn't get the chance to go to university, and who are likely to be all but invisible to most academics? Write something that tries to break down those boundaries. Think about discrimination, prejudice, social exclusion, questions of class, gender, ethnicity, and sexuality. And I know that you will generate important insights. It is a privileged life that we enjoy, and I'm certain you will make the most of it. Good luck. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you. Well, it's 1:05, so probably we'll have 5 to 10 minutes for some questions from the audience. Do we have any question? Something you would like to ask to Celia or to Stuart? Or you are too tired, hungry? No question? Well, I'll ask something to them. Tell me, Stuart first, tell me something more about your experience with this internet exclusive journal, yeah? And if your objective is to be indexed or to be in the list of the top journals or not, and the difficulties that can experience this kind of journals for being in the indexes.
Right. Thank you. It's an interesting question. I guess that my first journal experience was as deputy editor of Time and Society, which I did when I was an early career researcher, and that's a SAGE journal which continues to go from strength to strength. The journalism education began fairly recently. The people that were putting it together for the Association for Journalism Education asked me if I would like to be a co-editor. And I said that I was interested in principle and started to talk about what we might do with the journal. And they said to me, well, hold it. We just want to put your name on it. We don't actually want you involved in the editing of it. Which is rather bizarre, I thought. And it turned out it was because they had a rather sensitive kind of agenda, and they were a little bit worried perhaps of whether I would be trying to turn it into a more typical kind of commercial journal. And that is to say that, in other words, like all the other journals that were out there. And that is because it's a journal which aims at what are sometimes in the UK at least called hackademics. That is to say, people who have had successful careers in journalism and who are affecting that transition into teaching journalism at university. And many of them have not had the benefit of doctoral studies. They are learning sort of how to publish as academics the hard way, many of them. And they endure a lot of criticism and a lot of rejection in trying to bring about, a CV with a good publication profile on it. And so the point of this journal was to actually help facilitate that by being much more supportive. And that is to say, rather than just simply rejecting things outright and with the standard kinds of comments or criticisms, to actually take a more engaged approach by working with the person in question to help explain and bring along their experience to help ensure that they understand precisely what's involved and how and what they need to do in order to raise their work to a publishable standard. So I've thoroughly enjoyed working on the journal. It's much more labor intensive. It is never going to clock the level that some of the other journals we've heard about today. And that's not really its intention. Rather, it's to try to affect that kind of transition. And of course, many of the people who we've helped along the way who came to us with a paper which was pretty raw and would certainly not have survived any kind of refereeing process elsewhere, we've worked with them, and now they are on, publishing in the kinds of journals that are mentioned. So we're playing that kind of transitional role with that particular journal. Otherwise, I am, more involved with all the more typical kinds of academic journals in the field.
Thank you very much, Stuart. a question?
If it's possible.
Yeah,
Well,
sure.
thank you for your presentations, Stuart. It was awesome to listen to you because I felt very identified during the process of procrastination. So I have a very interesting question to include an extra network on this procrastination routine. What do you think about these academic social networks that are there, to try to connect the academic fields and the publications? I'm talking about like ResearchGate, and that kind of networks could be interesting for you. Would you recommend that to us?
I did start with 2 or 3 of them. I'm probably still on there somewhere, but I haven't posted to them in a very long time. So I'm not a big fan. And it does seem that whenever I do go on, it's invariably because I'm trying to track something down which I cannot find under any other, in any other way, any other journal search or anything else. And invariably it's not available. I get quite a few requests for articles directly, and I try to respond to them and send along proofs and so forth, even though I suppose technically we're not supposed to be doing that. I personally think that that's a good and necessary thing because we're all members of the same community. So many others may well disagree. I personally am not a big fan of these networks. I do, LinkedIn is something I never actually use, but it is one which, just by the volume of people coming at me through that, I do sort of engage with it a little bit more. I think, I guess that's the flip side of what I was describing earlier, and some of the other of our colleagues have mentioned it too, and that is there are, this extraordinary range of journals out there now, which is fantastic. It does mean that you can get your work into print, or at least available online, probably in a much more straightforward manner than has ever been the case before. But it is finding people who are actually aware of it and reading it that is increasingly difficult. I suppose that was the one benefit back in the day, certainly when I started, when there were only really a handful of journals in our subject area, that if you did manage to get a piece into one of them, then everybody sort of saw it. Whereas now, it's possible that the people directly in your area, with luck, will have seen it. But that feeling of kind of contributing to the wider sort of subject area is increasingly difficult to do. And making a reputation within that area is that much more formidable a challenge. So perhaps for some people, social networks can kind of help do that in terms of raising visibility. My concern there, I don't know whether Celia would agree, is just that it's sort of a two-edged sword. You have to be careful that you are not one of these people who becomes famous for being famous, and that is, famous because they're all over social media networks, but no one has any kind of real conception of them as a scholar. And I personally prefer, the publications to do the talking for me rather than trying to do it the other way around. But maybe I'm just too old school to be fully appreciative of the benefits of social networking. Do you want to say anything?
Well, I do think young scholars who are already on social networks, inevitably, they should be on ResearchGate, academia, edu, etc. Not only because of the visibility, but also because that's where the future of academic research lies. So I'm not a big fan of them either at all, but I do think you should be on there. That's a bit sad, but yeah. And about the what was I going to say? Oh, there's the most important thing is that you have an ORCID number, right? So that's like because the big difference with ORCID and the other commercial networking sites is that it's public, it's open source, and it's voluntary work. So this is a lot more reliable than all of the other commercial premium, non-premium. What is it? Business. It's a business model, right? So that's the downside of it.
I have the last question. Any of you want to ask anything? No? I have a question for Celia, that is the last one. If I understood it correctly, you said that you were accepting, or you are accepting preprints. Yeah, am I right? No, publishing them.
No, we're looking into that with Intellect. So
okay.
I can't really, let's say, decide that yet, because it's a question of the publisher as well. But I was just pointing it out as some kind of future tendency in general.
I think that,
yeah, for me personally, I think it's a good idea to start accepting preprints. So I'm trying to push that with the publisher.
okay, in fact, it was supposed that one of these people in these preprint companies had to be here this year, but it wasn't possible finally, because we are discussing a lot about this non-acceptance of preprints in social science, which is quite strange, because let's say hard science are accepting naturally the preprints papers. So I'm really happy that some publishers and journals are thinking about publishing preprint before papers. So
if I'm honest, when I raised the issue with the publisher, they hadn't really thought about it yet. So I do think I'm going to push for that, yeah.
Okay, congratulations and thank you. Let's leave it here. Now we're going to have lunch. And remember, recordad, lo digo en castellano porque la sesión va a ser en castellano, de que esta tarde, a partir de las 3, quizá lo retardamos un 15 minutos, ¿sí, Luis? A las 3:15 empezará la tercera y última parte de esta conferencia sobre aspectos más ligados a cuestiones nacionales o peninsulares. Open Access. Bueno, Luis puede informar mucho mejor, pero muy bien. Open Science, Open Access, etc. Journal Evaluation. Muy bien, perfecto. Nos vemos a las 3:15. Gracias a todos por haber venido.